All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Sashi Moorman. We're at Evening Land Vineyards in Salem. It's, Seven Springs Vineyard in Salem. I guess both. It's May 24th, 2022. Sashi, thank you so much for joining us today. First question to get us started is why wine?
Why wine? In the difference between being interested in the wine industry in the U.S. compared to a place like Europe, where families share wine with their children at an earlier age, or if your parents or grandparents were in the industry, you would have been exposed. Here in the U.S., you have a lot of people who are in the wine industry whose families were never involved in the wine business. And so, unfortunately, wine is one of those subjects where here you don't really start your journey on it until you're, in most states, 21. Just because of the regulations around alcohol. So for me, I remember my parents drinking wine. I remember they were interested in it. So it was kind of, it was interesting to me just because it was off limits. Like, what is that? Being a product of Gen X, I was, influenced by, at that time, status symbols were very important to people, and wine definitely had a status, and so that was curious to me. Like, so, why is that expensive? Why is that desirable? I also had a huge interest in food, so in college, I got my degree in geography, but I spent all my summers working in restaurants cooking. I spent most of my time in college cooking, and I tried to figure out how to use my degree to do something closer to what I was interested in, which was cooking, and that led me to wine, because there's this very strong correlation between wine and geography. So I did my dissertation on Zinfandel, and it's interesting. By just reading a few books, I ascertained quite quickly that there's a strong relationship between people and place and wine, and that fit right into my degree. And the professor who I was assigned to was really excited about the paper, and I traveled to Napa Valley and I interviewed Joel Peterson, who was at that time still the owner of Ravenswood, and I forgot his last name, but he owned, Seps was his last name. He owned Storybook Mountain, which was another Zinfandel producer, and it was fun. They were very different people doing really different work with Zinfandel, and I think that was my first real understanding of like how the human element plays an enormous factor. Everyone talks about different appellations, different grapes, but there isn't. In the industry, we downplay the person a lot. We try and uphold the idea of terroir, the idea of noble varieties, and there's less focus on the people. And I think doing my thesis, I really realized how, even though I knew very little about wine, I could taste how different the wines were, and it was obvious to me it was more than just place. The person was having a huge impact on how the wine was made. So I pursued cooking after college. But I ended up working for a gentleman running a small restaurant who also bought all the wine for the restaurant. He was very academic about it, so studied everything that we ever purchased. I mean, was very interested in understanding where the wine came from, who made it, what its history was, and so it was a priceless education because it was one of these restaurants where we did family dinner after service, not before. So after the last guest left, we would cook for the whole crew, kitchen in front of the house, and we'd all sit down together. And Jonathan was always opening bottles of wine, and yeah, I was definitely hooked. So yeah.
So before we get into wine, I'm curious. You mentioned sort of food from a young age and cooking from a young age as an interest. So tell me about what interested you about food and cooking, and you mentioned kind of how you pursued that first. Tell me about sort of how that pursuit, where that pursuit took you, the pursuit of food and cooking, where it took you.
Yeah, I, like most people who first kind of get interested in food and cooking, I was enamored by Michelin star restaurants and chefs and chef lights, and I worked at a French restaurant, La Niche, in Bethesda, Maryland, where I went to high school, and but I was very fortunate that I went to Vassar College, and man that I met there was also from Washington, D.C., and he was working at a organic farm. And he said, I deliver vegetables to all these restaurants in Washington, D.C., and I can tell you there's this one restaurant that is not like any other restaurant in Washington, D.C. And I said, oh, what's that? And he said, it's called the Obelisk. And so I looked it up, and I went and reached out to the owner, Peter Paston, who is now my business partner in one of my wineries and a very close friend, godfather to my daughter. And sure enough, he was not like any other chef that I had met, and certainly was running a restaurant that was not like other restaurants that I worked in. It was just very, it was just really smart. Like he's very intelligent, and his staff was so like culturally interested in a more diverse way. So music in the kitchen was always, either, just a wide range of music, and then we'd listen to the news, and just, it was unlike other kitchens that I worked in. Everyone was very thoughtful. And Peter is a gifted cook, one of the best cooks I've ever met, and also had a great appreciation for wine. And I learned more about wine when I was working in New York, but Peter was a huge influence in helping me understand that there's a big difference between kind of commercial industrial wine and highly crafted artisan wine. So it was through him that I understood that, both at the restaurant cooking level and at the wine level. And I quickly figured out that, most restaurants, even very fancy restaurants, operate very much like their assembly line. Almost industrial in its approach, without a lot of creativity from the rest of the kitchen staff, except for maybe the chef. But really, it was like a cafeteria. It was a set menu. Maybe it changed seasonally. Most likely not. A lot of restaurants have the same items on their menu the whole year, and so as a cook, it was quite robotic. Versus Peter's restaurant, where the menu changed every day. The restaurant I worked in New York, where the menu changed every day, and we we shop for our produce at the farmer's market, and we shop for our fish at the fish market in Fulton Street. This was the kind of interaction that I really felt connected to. That the raw material and being skilled at always cooking whatever you could find that was the best. So if you went to the farmer's market and there were beautiful mushrooms or beautiful turnips or beautiful ramps, whatever was in season and beautiful, that's what you bought, and then that's what you cooked. Instead of a menu that you just executed day after day. And I think that was helpful in me being ready for the wine business.
So as you were being introduced to wine, you mentioned obviously coming from a restaurant lens. Tell me about the process of sort of learning wine, educating yourself on wine, and also of selling it at that level. What did you have to know about wine in order to sell it? And what did you find was successful when it came to selling wine?
I mean, I never want to go back to the restaurant business, but I miss it every day. It's like smoking cigarettes, right? I miss it every day, but I never want to do it again. It's just so wonderful. I mean, you are responsible for a couple of hours of, people's utter joy. And obviously, not everyone has a good time in a restaurant. Plenty of customers come in, they're not having a great time. No fault to the restaurant. But on those evenings when the kitchen is just synchronized and the front of the house is just doing a great job and the whole room is like happy and laughing, and you're hearing the clinking glasses and the utensils on plates, and people are drinking, and it's that atmosphere is magic. And so I knew that even though I didn't want to stay specifically in the restaurant business, I knew I wanted to be close to it. So I guess I'm restaurant adjacent. Wine business is a way to still be connected to the restaurant business, still be connected to that wonderful energy of hospitality, and also I truly believe this. There's such thing as being a really good guest. It's an art form that is sadly lost on most people. But there is a thing as being a really great guest and a great customer. Coming in and being excited for the food and excited to try a wine that you never had before. It's just it's lovely.
So when that kind of, those evenings when you talk about the kind of everything working right, what role does the wine play?
Well, I think as I've gotten older, I appreciate now more the power that wine has, and not specifically wine, really just alcohol. Human beings are socially very awkward, right? Like we constantly have a hard time connecting with other people, particularly people we don't know. In fact, I think as creatures, we have very high levels of anxiety of meeting people we don't know, trying to ascertain their body language. Do they like me? Do they not like me? Should I be here? Am I wearing the right clothes? Does anyone understand me? Or and wine as a vehicle to deliver alcohol is in my opinion, the highest expression of alcohol. Just has a magical effect on making people feel more comfortable. It just it relaxes people. It obviously inhibits a little bit of the social anxiety, and people who normally maybe wouldn't have had a good time. I mean, I've seen it so many times in a restaurant, and so many times just in my business, just being in the wine business and doing sales and working with clients, and it just, if there's not wine on the table, it's a very different conversation.
So you mentioned being kind of exposed to the sort of farm to table, sort of different style at a time when that wasn't terribly common yet for consumers. As you were going forward, and as you started to sort of think about the next thing you were going to do, what was the sort of takeaway from that? What was the sort of philosophy around food and drink that you were taking away from your work in wine, and how did that kind of springboard you into the next phase of your work?
So I left New York City in 1996 and just decided I wanted to go try the wine business. And it was it's so easy to get a job in a restaurant because there's like millions of them. And so I had very naively thought it would be similar to get a job in the wine industry. I was shocked when I came out west, and so wasn't formally trained in cooking, obviously wasn't formally trained in winemaking, and so my mode of entry was just to write letters to people who I had heard were running great programs, either in kitchens or When I did that in New York, trying to find my first job in the city working in a restaurant, I was pleasantly surprised at how many people responded and asked me to come in and just chat with them. And in the wine business, I got zero response. I mean, zero. And I wrote to Dick Ponzi, and Jim Clendenin, a couple people in Napa Valley, just across from Oregon, even Washington State, and zero response. But I'd already committed myself, so I said, well, I'll just drive out there and go actually knock on the door. And I quickly learned that wineries are, for the most part, they're all understaffed. The low margin aspect of our business results in wineries not being so different from a restaurant. And I just got very, very lucky. Adam Tolmack, who is the owner of the Ojai Vineyard in Ojai, California, he and his wife Helen, they had just had their first child, and they worked together in the winery, and she was not going to be able to participate in the 96 harvest as much as she had in the past. And so after I went and saw him, had lunch with him and his wife, he told me there wasn't a job, but then he called me 3 weeks later and said, you know what, we changed our mind. We could probably use some help. And so I was actually in Oregon trying to find a job and drove back. And I couldn't have asked for a better experience because it was a true apprenticeship. It was just me and Adam. And he didn't have any vineyards at the time. So, and I think that was to my advantage too. I feel like I learned the fundamentals, which is working in a cellar, being a cellar rat, understanding wine from its most kind of basic building blocks, which is just making it. And Adam was a great winemaker, and he had a great cellar, and we drank a lot of really good wines and worked together in the winery. And that first harvest, I remember it was late. It was a late harvest, and we had a bunch of Syrah that we had harvested from Bienesito. And at that time, Adam was doing kind of punch downs, fermentation management on a very regular interval over a 24-hour period. So there was always a punch down to do at midnight. And so I remember it was at the very end of the harvest. We were into November. It was cold outside, and I was in the barn doing punch downs, and he walked down from the house with a bottle of La Chapelle. I think it was 89, and he said, "Hey, I just want to say thank you. It's been really great working with you this harvest." And I finished my punch downs, and he opened the bottle of wine, and we sat there. Stars are all out. I was like, oh my God, like I am never leaving this industry. It was just magic. And so I stayed there for 5 years. And I think that helped me because I approached that job like I approached a kitchen job. They're very similar. You're just working with much bigger pieces of equipment. You do a lot of washing, and the application of what I learned cooking, which is how important the raw ingredients are, correlated, perfectly to winemaking. The quality of the grapes. You can be a great winemaker, but if you don't have the highest quality grapes, you're never going to make the best wine.
Was there anything, obviously you mentioned kind of the basics of the job, a lot of cleaning, a lot of manual labor, a lot of strange hours. What was attractive about that to you? What about that kind of grunt work made you want to keep doing it?
I think it's not very intellectual, but there's a lot of skill. And so learning all these new skills was really exciting. Like learning how to drive a forklift, learning how to rack wine, learning how to fix things. This equipment's always breaking. And it was just a whole new set of skills, a whole new set of experiences that really kept me very engaged. I think once that skill set, that learning curve started to plateau, I started wanting to expand. And so that's why I left in 2001 and went to go work for Tom and Marilyn Stoltman in Ballard Canyon. They had a 220-acre piece of property with 80 acres of vineyard on it. And that was my opportunity to then learn about the farming aspect, how to control the quality of the fruit.
Thank you. Before I get to that, because I'm very curious about the farming part of things, tell me about what you learned about. You talked about the influence a person has.
Yeah.
Tell me about what you learned about that in those first kind of 5 years, where you're just purely working with the fruit that's coming in. You're not farming it. You're not. What was the influence that you saw being imparted in the winery?
Well, you obviously see that in the restaurant business too. A lot of great restaurants are run by chefs that have pretty big personalities. It's that, it's kind of like it's like anything. There's a reactive way of cooking, and there's a conceptual way of cooking, and I think there's the same with the wine business. There's reactive winemaking, and there's conceptual winemaking, which is you have an idea of what kind of wine you want to make, and then you try and find the grapes, whether they're your own, and you figure out how to farm them in a way that achieves what you want. It could be in the cellar through hundreds of different decisions that you make and how you make the wine to achieve your goal. But I think that's where I really understood that people who had a very strong conceptualization of what they wanted to make, and whatever you want to call that, vision or inspiration, but if that element is very strong, and it was matched with highly skilled technique in the winery and either the ability to work with great grapes because you purchase them or you farm them yourself. When those things all match up, the wines are special.
So as you moved on to the next thing, then you mentioned kind of this now your first experience with farming at that level. So tell me about that. Tell me about the process of learning the farming and of what the kind of the biggest lessons for you or biggest takeaways were.
I think it was, in the wine business, people are always, I don't know, they're always like, it might be a youth thing too. You're looking for the silver bullet. You're looking for like is it because you sort all your grapes, or is it because you do this long cold soak, or is it because you only do pump overs and not punch downs, or because you use these kinds of barrels? I mean, everyone's looking for like this like kind of secret element that's going to differentiate their wine, make it special. And in the vineyard, you do the same thing. You think in the beginning, it's because I, branch lock all my shoots and everything is perfectly, parallel positioned, and it's like, thin the crop, or I irrigate a certain way if you're in California. And I mean, it took me a long time to learn it. I mean, it took me a very long time to learn that it's not that those techniques are not important. They are, but they can only enhance what's already there. So if it's the wrong grape planted in the wrong place, which I would argue most of America is in that position because the wine industry is so young. We unfortunately, I think as an industry, the domestic wine industry, we unfortunately don't embrace changes very well in the wine industry. So, we decide, Cabernet Sauvignon is what belongs in Napa Valley, and Pinot Noir is what belongs in Willamette Valley. And, why? Because someone in 1970 decided that? It's not long enough. It's not, it's very premature. I understand from a marketing perspective that it's, there's a strong marketing advantage. But I would like to see our industry be a little bit more open-minded and embrace change and the people who are trying new things, and keep an open mind that, you know what? Okay, so my dad planted Syrah here, but maybe that's not really what belongs here. It's all part of the process. It's all part of the evolution. It's all part of trying to find that most sympathetic match between grape variety, soil, climate, and own personal winemaking style.
So at this point, did you have, when you came into that role in 2001, did you have a kind of an idea of this is the right way to farm, this is the wrong way to farm?
My idea was to make 100-point wine. It's pathetic. But that was what was so, Robert Parker was highly influential at that time, and wineries, he made and destroyed wineries with his reviews. And so I think all of us, young winemakers, were very preoccupied by scores, particularly from Robert Parker. And So do we make the wines for Robert Parker? I don't know. I don't think so, but we definitely held his values. And some of them which were very good, like unfined, unfiltered. Wine is supposed to be delicious. He was reacting to a lot of insipid industrial wine. And I think his instincts were spot on. I mean, there were a lot of people doing a disservice to wine to make it more stable, make it more consistent, real industrialization of wine. And he wanted to promote people who were making wine for pleasure. He just had a very somewhat specific view of what that meant. So no, I didn't. I mean, I was determined to dry farm, achieve very low yields in the vineyard, spend way too much money in terms of farming it perfectly, and then in a winery, employing long cold soaks and lots of punch downs, and really extracting the grapes and getting lots of color and concentration and weight, power. What I didn't understand was that none of that at that time was matched with grace and elegance and levity. So the first winery I started is Pedro Sashi, which I started in 2003, and that is a really fun exercise to taste from first vintage to current vintage, because it's in a glass of wine the narrative arc of what I think is a typical young winemaker's journey, going from power to elegance, or learning how to bring elegance to power. Like a lot of young people at the beginning, you just want to be loud. You want to play your music loud. You want to speak loudly. You've got all these ideas. You want everyone to listen to you. And then as you get older, you realize that what's most important is that people are paying attention to your wine because it's saying something very distinctive. It doesn't taste like other people's wines. And it asks the question, why? This is my favorite question from any customer. Why is your wine different?
Well, I'm going to ask you that in a little while, so don't worry, because you had a chance to tell us about that. What prompted you to start your first wine, your first own thing?
I think at the heart of it, more than I think I was always going to be an entrepreneur. I think that is. I don't think I could have put my finger on it in 2003, but I had started, traveling to Europe and visiting wineries, and just really understanding that the European wine industry was wonderfully rooted in history and tradition, but also completely constrained by that. And that one of the joys of being an American winemaker is that we can bring this amazing entrepreneurial spirit to wine. And to me, it truly is the most exciting part.
So when you started it, what was the vision for it? What were you trying to say with it?
For Pedro Sashi, I've always loved Syrah. It was like one of the first wines from the Rhone Valley, or some of the first wines that really caught my attention. Because I was in the restaurant business, and Syrah is probably the most gastronomic grape. When we describe the flavors and aromas of most grape varieties wines, we really focus on like fruit, red fruits, lemon, citrus. But with Syrah, you use descriptors like, bacon fat and, aged meat and olive, black pepper. These are all culinary. So to me, Syrah has this wonderful simpatico with food, which is why it was the first wines that I really fell in love with. So Pietro Sassi wasn't just an homage to that grade and to pursuing really gastronomic wines.
With for the first time being kind of all you and all your decisions and all of your sort of your own personal terroir into this, what do you think of that? What were those wines like, and how was your what was your reaction to them when you first, sort of had your first thing with your name on it?
It was thrilling. I mean, some people are paralyzed, by, oh my God, like, what do I do? There's so many decisions. For better or for worse, I don't have that problem. And it was so exciting to choose, which vineyards to work with, how to participate in the farming of those vineyards, because Pietro Sassi is a negociant. We don't own any vineyards. Which, by the way, I think for young winemakers, that is, I think it's the best path to first purchase grapes, because you get to work with lots of different vineyards, you get to work with lots of different growers, you just learn a lot. But then, how to make the wine. I mean, creating a label, the storytelling behind that. Pietro Sassi, it's a made-up word. A play on Peter, who's a mentor of mine and a business partner, and Pietro Sassi, who I worked for in Washington D.C. He's that chef that I talked about earlier, and Sashi, so Pietro Sassi, and Piedras are rocks in Spanish, and Sassi are stones in Italian. And those are very important ingredients in Syrah vineyards. So all of that's just so much fun. I mean, the creation of a brand and the ability to go tell the story and to, just like now, just make customers smile. Like that's your first job, right? Like in wine sales, like just elicit a positive response even before they smell or taste the wine. Which I think a lot of people forget that.
What was the response to your wine, and what was your response to that response?
It was funny because the original label is very different than the current label. The original label it was a bit of a failure. I had a friend of mine draw a slingshot on the label. Everyone thought it was a farming implement. They're like, what is that? Is that like, because there's a little stone there too. It's like, is that a potato? Is that like, I was like, oh my God, this is a total fail. But it was a slingshot because it was a reference to David and Goliath. We were this tiny little winery against all these giants. And so once you told people the story, you got that response. Everyone smiles and like okay, well, that part worked. Just no one got the label, unfortunately. But it still was great. And it was a part of the process, part of the journey. The label today is different. It's much more beautiful and more classic.
What about to the wine itself? You mentioned that you're still kind of at that point where you're thinking score, you're thinking big audience, you're thinking how do people react to the wines?
Well, one thing that I think I don't know if it's so much the case today, but certainly when I was getting started in the wine business, you didn't you didn't understand or you didn't want to sell the wine. You really looked at yourself as I'm a winemaker. And you actually looked at wine sales as something kind of dirty. In fact, Adam Tolmack, when I was leaving the Ojai Vineyard, I think he probably laid down his biggest insult to me. He's like, you know what, you'd be a much better wine salesman than a winemaker. I was really pissed off. But he was right in many ways. I don't know if that still exists in the wine business, but certainly back then, what was noble was to be a winemaker or a vineyard manager. What was dirty was being a salesperson, which I think is completely ridiculous. So yeah, we were making the wines so that we wouldn't have to sell them, hoping to get strong scores, have customers find us through Robert Parker. I mean, it's a really bad strategy, both for the business and for your own soul, because you're not following your own inspiration.
So what came next?
Well, next came meeting Rashad Parr, who I don't think there's a man on the planet that is more dedicated to following his own path. And it was a joy to befriend him and taste with him. I mean, he's an exceptionally talented wine professional, and I learned so much. And he definitely, creates and follows his own path. And he doesn't, it's not that he doesn't consider other people's opinion, because he values other people's opinion very much, particularly his peers. But it's that he doesn't factor general acceptance as a part of the equation to success. So Sandy was born because he just was determined to make Chardonnay in California that was low alcohol, high in acidity, had fantastic aging potential, and was, most importantly, complex. Picking grapes early and making wines in low in alcohol is pretty easy. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is doing that and still ending up with a wine that is concentrated and elegant and complex. And Raj and I were we were a great match for each other, because he brought all of this experience and this repertoire of knowledge of white Burgundy and had access to so much amazing wine. We drank so much amazing wine. And it was at a time when, I'm not going to say it was affordable, but it was a lot more affordable than it is today. And so our reference points were just, I still look back on that and think how lucky we both were. I mean, we were drinking the best wines in the world, and those were our benchmarks. I think that is another thing that is very difficult in the wine business, particularly for young winemakers. How are you supposed to understand great wine if you can't afford great wine? And it's different than just like getting a little taste. Part of wine is the pain, right? So buying a really expensive bottle of wine and not liking it. It's fundamental to your own education. Figuring out what it is that you like, and also figuring out that wine is not consistent. And just because it got a great review or someone said it was great, it might be a bad bottle for 100 different reasons. I mean, I have this conversation with my employees all the time about, using natural cork. And this came from my friend Peter Paston, who said, "Oh no, I think TCA is an important part of the wine business." And I was like, "Explain that to me." It's like, because when you open a bottle of wine, particularly a bottle of wine that you've been holding on to for 20 years, and it's a great bottle of wine, and you maybe even bought it at the winery, and you brought it back with you on the airplane, and it's been sitting in your cellar, there is an element of risk. That wine could be corked. And so when you open it, there's a thrill. And if you remove that whole part of enjoying wine. And I think he's so right about that. And I think it's part of something that I try and instill now in my own company, which is the wine business is largely about embracing risk. From farming, as we've experienced with wildfires and frost, you must embrace risk. And in the winery, you make decisions that you can either be very prophylactic in your winemaking, or you can embrace risk. And then also just, selling it, storytelling, what your label looks like. I think that all those things were part of it.
So tell me about starting the brand with Raj, and you have this vision for what you're going to do. Did it feel like a risk at the time? Did it feel like you were challenging the
It wasn't my risk.
establishment?
I was very happy to be to support him. He was at that time very controversial. There was an infamous article about basically a tete with Robert Parker, and he just declared that at all of his restaurants he was no longer going to have any wines over 14 degrees of alcohol. I mean, just was a lightning rod for people saying, "Oh my God!" That from that he gave birth with some of his colleagues to In Pursuit of Balance, which was hugely beneficial to the California wine industry. For those of us that were able to participate with In Pursuit of Balance, to be able to go as a group, as a like-minded group of people making very good wines, going to London, going to Tokyo, going to New York, promoting American wine, but made in this way. I mean, I remember so many people just being shocked. Like, oh my God, I had no idea that these wines were available. I had no idea that American winemakers were making wine like this. I mean, it was thrilling. And so I felt so lucky to be part of that. But that was all Raj's risks. I mean, I was along for the ride. And I was facilitating him. I was finding great vineyards to work with, building a great wine program, working with him to make that happen.
What did you feel like your role was then? If you're alongside someone who elicits such strong opinion, what's your role in the relationship?
Well, I was taking my own risks tangentially. So in 2007, I planted Domaine de la Côte. And this was a vineyard planted where there were no other vineyards, on the far western side of the San Diego Hills, where people didn't think you could get grapes right. I am a very good salesman, and I convinced my partners to spend an extraordinary amount of money on a huge risk. And that will always be for me the wine that I'm most emotionally connected to, because I just staked so much on it, and I had no reason to know that it would be successful, other than I conceptualized it, and we went through many ups and downs. It has been a really difficult experience, but today, Raj and I planted Domaine de la Côte in 2007. Raj joined me at Domaine de la Côte in 2013. So, we joined forces knowing that it was the right thing to do for the winery. And at that time, I was still very much in that, like, well, my job is to make the wines, and I was going headfirst into also like developing vineyards, like how to develop it, how to think about planting vineyards in a novel way in California. You have to make so many consequential choices when you plant a vineyard that you're going to live with for a very long time. And so, I mean, I look back on that. There's no way I could do it today. It's too much doubt. And I was 35 years old, and I didn't have any doubt. I was a genius. That was reckless, but it was to my advantage because I was so sure of myself. So sure, I mean, I think you have to be. You just have to be. So it wasn't like just dipping our toe in the water. It was like going all in, 4,000 vines to the acre. Just very a really what is it in roulette? Putting your bets on 0-0, like lowest odds of winning. But if you do, it's going to be great. And bringing Raj in the picture was a way to really help promote Domaine de la Côte, because he fell in love with the vineyards, as I did, fell in love with the wines, recognized very early, like, whoa, this doesn't taste like anything else in California. And so we kind of, that was our relationship. We were working kind of in tandem with Sandy and Domaine de la Côte. Sandy kind of being, his brainchild, Domaine de la Côte being mine, and then helping each other promote our dreams.
So I'm curious about that confidence you mentioned. You don't strike me as someone who would just do something without thinking through and looking at and having a reason behind. So what made you think it would work? Where did that confidence come from? And when you're planning something like Domaine de la Côte, why? What about that spot? What about that style?
It had to do with understanding that all the wines that I liked, all the wines that I loved to drink, were wines that came from vineyards that had very naturally low yields, either because the vines were very, very old, or because it was planted in soil that was, very weak in terms of its fertility. And so the vines were, like, you go to a Côte Rôtie, vineyards planted on pure granite, steep hillsides, no soil. And you look at these tiny little vines and these small amount of fruit that was being produced by each vine. And you go to Burgundy and you look at old vines that are producing also a very small amount of grapes, and you go and you taste the wines, and it just started to really come into focus for me. It's like, oh, okay, so low vigor, low yields leads to the kind of raw material that I wanted to work with. And then Raj and I, as wine drinkers, were very much aligned in appreciating Burgundy from cooler vintages. We always, at that time, in the mid 2000s, 1990 was kind of like the great vintage in Burgundy, the Total Parker vintage, like really opulent wines. And I remember Raj and I drinking a lot of those and just being like, it's just, we like the cooler vintages. And Domaine de la Côte, during the summer, average temperatures 70 degrees. It's really cold, and so it's like having a cool vintage every year. And so it was those two things: naturally low yields, always working with a cool vintage. And the site is just—it's a very beautiful place, like Seven Springs. And I just think that has a power. And I don't, it's nice to think that maybe the vines have this sense too that they're in a beautiful place. Probably not. But so do the people. All the people who have to touch those vines, farm them, and make wine from them. There's no question in my mind that influences the final product. That's just that connection, like just you have a certain reverence because you're like, wow, this place is so beautiful. I have to work a little bit harder. I have to really do my job at my highest level because this is such a beautiful place.
Can't let the place down.
Yeah, there's something to that. Yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned ups and downs. Tell me about the rollout of the wines from there and of how you felt about them and how they were received.
I mean, we did well on how the wines were received. What I didn't understand was just the costs. So many vines per acre and such low yields, and starting off a winery from nothing. No history. No one had ever heard of Domaine-le-Côte. No one had even heard of the Sangria Hills. I did not appreciate and did not anticipate how long it would take. And we got very lucky because obviously Salem 3 just put us on the map, and that opened a lot of doors for us. Having Jancis Robinson say that this is as great as wine as, Bachelet, and having such a respected critic of wine, not know that it wasn't Burgundy. And that it was not only that, but it was great Burgundy. It just turned everyone's head. And so that was very helpful, but we still were not out of the woods. I mean, costs were out of control. And they're still out of control. But the difference is that today we can charge enough for the wine to start to balance those costs. And that's just something that, again, if I had gone to business school, I would have never done it. I would have modeled the business, and my financial partners would have said, yeah, you're insane. Good luck. We're not doing that. Go find someone else. So, that's part of it, is just some of that naivete is important, but particularly to starting new things. Today, that's why I just couldn't do it today. Today I know too much. Today I run, 4 wineries. I'm thinking about sales and revenue and debt all the time. It would inhibit me. But that's why I think in large part doing new things in the wine business is for young people. Having some recklessness is good.
Talked about obviously the sort of the price rising to meet the cost of your wine. I'm curious about that from a perspective of someone who has come up in the business. How do you feel about having prices be at that point? Do you feel, is that a point of pride? Is that a point of, how does that make you feel?
Strange. Evening Land was started by Mark Tarlov, and he just crashed onto the scene here and infuriated the local community, both by acquiring the lease on Seven Springs in Andon and deciding to turn it into a monopole, so no longer selling grapes to anybody. Also, grossly overpaying on the lease. I mean, that's how he got it. The McDonald family did the right thing. They went to all of their customers and said, you want to pay the same as this guy wants to pay, we'd be very happy to lease it to you. because he's an outsider and we've been working with you for a long time. And many of them were very upset. None of them said, you know, Al, good for you. You've been doing this for a long time. Like, you deserve all of that. I can't make that work. No, they were mad at him. And then they were mad at Mark Tarloff. And I understand the feelings. But price is something that, unfortunately, is important, depending on how ambitious the winery is and what it wants to do. But people, I think, view it as, well, you just think you're better than the rest of us. And no, this is what we have to do to make it work. And so then, you know, he insulted the community again by releasing Sumam in 2007 at $120 a bottle. And everyone was like, you are out of your mind. It was fascinating that no one looked at that and said, you know what? That's great. Dominique Lafong, Seven Springs, $120 for Oregon Chardonnay. Like, I hope that's successful, because that's just going to open the door for the rest of us to come in behind that and charge $60 or $70, like half, but way more than they were able to get before. So I think I don't know, like. I don't have a problem with it because all the stories that I read in the wine industry, Angelo Gaia charging 5 times as much for his, you know, Barbaresco than even his neighbors in Barolo, which was supposed to be a better commune. Everyone was so mad at him. And La Louise Loire charging huge amounts of money for her wine, and everyone being so upset. But these people were instrumental in lifting the whole appellation. I think today people view it differently. I think people today are more excited. People want to know, well, what is the limit? And none of us know, like, what is the limit? How much can you charge for a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir Chardonnay? Now, the thing about pricing is that it has, that kind of pricing is tied to scarcity. So I think that is something that, you know, we have an advantage at Dominion Côte with that, because the St. Rita Hills is not that big. We don't produce that much wine in St. Rita Hills. And then on top of that, we don't produce that much wine at Dominion Côte. And there are not a lot of people that make wine like that wine. In Oregon, it's a little bit more challenging because the appellations are well formed, the sub-appellations, but there's not a sense of scarcity. There's not a sense of like, wow, like, you know, if you don't jump on that wine, you're never going to be able to see it again, kind of thing. It will come. I know it will. But I think that, you know, for me, like, Raj and I, even though we have a financial partner, you know, we are not wealthy people, and our wineries, we're forced to run them as businesses. And so when we make investments, those are debts that we carry forward with us. And so it's important for what we want to do that we can achieve the pricing, because it helps us make decisions that we know are the right decisions for, you know, planting new vineyards and farming it the way we want to farm, and just exploring the potential.
So you mentioned, obviously, this place, Seven Springs, Evening Land. What point does Oregon you mentioned Oregon was a place you started looking for a job. At what point does Oregon become part of the story again?
So so I was involved with Evening Land in 2005. I made the first wine from Mark Tarlov from the Occidental Vineyard. And so I've, you know, been part of the Evening Land story since day one. I was never responsible for the wines here at the winery in Oregon until 2014. Raj and I took over the program that vintage, both farming and winery. And, it was an easy decision when our financial partner wanted, he just saw what we were doing in California, and he he is amazed at how expensive the wine business is to participate in. But he was so, he loves the passion and the enthusiasm. And so he saw that in me and Raj with Domaine Wilcote, and I think he wanted to give Evening Land that opportunity. There's just that level of excitement. Mm-hmm. And Raj and I, this is an historic vineyard, and we had ideas. We believe very much in Oregon Chardonnay. We were greatly helped by the wines that Dominique Lafon made at Evening Land. They were fantastic. It was really clear that there was something extraordinarily special. And we wanted to explore that further here at Seven Springs. And then we also had a lot of ideas about Pinot Noir in Oregon too. And Raj is someone who, his approach to winemaking, like the pathway to finding the wine is the opposite of mine. I started, and it has to do with our when we entered into the wine business on a kind of a winemaking level. I've always started with you maybe extract a little bit too much, not intentionally, but just because you're trying to get the most. And if the wine is out of balance, a little coarse, doesn't have that elegance, then you begin to refine to find the correct expression. Raj's is the opposite. He always likes to extract extremely lightly, and then as he gets to know the site and the vineyard, begin to have more confidence to pull more from the grapes. That was our early history together. So when we took over Domaine Wilcote, Evening Land in 2014, we had already had so many discussions about this pathway and how to find the wine, our wine, and we were always big fans of Seven Springs Pinot Noirs, but we also found them to be rustic. And we knew that the wines aged exceptionally well, but straight out of the gates, they kind of had this coarseness to them. And so we came into it immediately to try and find that lighter touch. And it's been hard because 2015 was very dry and hot, 2018, very dry, hot, and so we have not been successful every vintage, but 17 and 19, now 21, we really we're so happy with finding the way to make the wines here just softer and more charming. Maybe we're sacrificing the ageability of the wine, but I think we believe so much in the ageability of the Chardonnays that we're okay with that. Everyone has their own idea of what is a beautiful wine and how to make a beautiful wine. I've really learned from Raj that just don't pay attention to what other people say. Just do what you think is best. And I think it takes a lot of drinking wine to get there. I saw that in him. His confidence came from just drinking so much wine. And as I've had time to catch up, drink a lot of wine too, I can feel the same way now. It's just it's impossible when you're starting out to have that, because you don't have the experience. You haven't tasted enough wine to really know, yes, that to me that's the definition of balance. That's the definition of elegance. That's the definition of just lift. Combination of concentration, power, but still being light on its feet. Effortless.
So you had gone from your last project where you had created a vineyard where nothing had been before to taking over, as you mentioned, an established and fairly legendary vineyard. Tell me about your impression of the vineyard as you were starting to work here. What did it look like to you, and what did you kind of foresee in terms of changes or tweaks you wanted to make to it to bring out the best?
I think most people probably don't appreciate that we're California winemakers. I very much appreciate that we're California winemakers. I think we bring our perspective here, and I think that something that I recognized very quickly is that, and I think most people don't know this, Domaine-la-Côte is a much cooler climate than Willamette Valley, than the Willamette Hills, by a long shot. And so I think because we have palm trees in California, people think that it's, like the desert. I don't think they understand that Raj and I are very, very experienced now in growing grapes in extremely cool climate, and this is not a cool climate. This is actually a very warm growing season, and it's a short season. So bud break is late, and harvest can be quite early if it rains. So you have a shorter amount of time to work with the grapes, ripening the grapes, versus in California you have a very long period of time. And so we were able to ascertain very quickly, okay, so these are the fundamental qualities of this terroir. Deep soils, have a lot of water holding capacity, very different from what I'm used to in California. Very warm, and very warm at the end of the day, 6, 7 o'clock. That was, here they're very used to it, but for me, I was like, it's very unusual. Most places in the world that grow grapes, the warmest time of day is 1 o'clock. Therefore, that's why most vineyards are planted on a north-south axis, because you're trying to protect the grapes at solar noon, which is when there's the most heat, the most radiation. But here, that happens at 6 p.m. And people still plant their rows north-south. Here is an exceptional site because a lot of our vineyards, particularly the Summa vineyards, are planted east-west. And Raj and I were able to quickly see that, look, 6 p.m., all the grapes are in the shadow because the sun is setting, it's low on the horizon, and we're also on an east-facing slope, so that also helps with protecting the grapes from that intense heat. And so I think that that was a real benefit, coming to it with that perspective, because it was so different than what we were used to. So our relationship here is not, we didn't create this place, we're stewards, but we have a fresh perspective. And so we were able to come here and think about it differently.
And you mentioned before we started filming that you now own the vineyards here. So tell me about how that came to be, and once they were yours, what were the first things you had to do?
Well, it's a huge accomplishment for us. We had a 15-year lease, and the business has been hard to run. I mean, it's been financially very challenging, but we knew that there's so much potential here, and so we exercised our option, and we purchased both properties, and it has started to change my relationship, because one of the things that is also really wonderful about the domestic wine industry, American wine industry, is that many of the people who own vineyards own a lot of land. So, in Burgundy, you own 4 rows of a little vineyard. Your relationship to the environment is really different when you have a very small piece, or you're just buying grapes, or even if you're just leasing a vineyard. Like, we were just leasing the vineyards here. So we didn't have to think about being custodians of the whole 240 acres. We were only concerned with the vineyards. Now, I'm very preoccupied with land stewardship. We have this tremendous wildlife corridor along Kings Creek that is on our property. And now understanding that our role here is to also protect that, and to protect the vineyards, and to try and build something that will outlast our lifetimes. That has completely changed the relationship that we have to this place, and not so much how we make the wines, but how we talk about the wines and what we want to do. I think I'm a little more patient now with making sure that we're taking the right steps, because there's no question in my mind that this vineyard will be part of the Oregon wine industry for hopefully forever. I mean, it's just in a truly amazing site.
Tell me about your impressions of the Oregon wine industry, both while you were adjacent to it and interacting with it, and then once you became more involved in it. What were the first impressions? What did you think of Oregon's industry, and how have you seen it change and grow as you've been aware of it?
I mean, I just think in the last 10 years, the Oregon wine industry has become such an exciting place. I know it ruffles a lot of feathers, but it's good that outside investment's coming into the Willamette Valley. That brings fresh perspective. It brings more attention and more opportunity for everybody. I know that it increases costs for land, and people feel that they can't participate, and that's an unfortunate consequence. But in the long run, it's good. And just to see what people are doing in Hood River, also just the expansion of getting outside the Willamette Valley and people exploring different grape varieties, all the wonderful Chardonnays that are now being produced from a lot of different winemakers. It's just it's super exciting. And I think that maybe one of the when Raj and I first started coming here to Oregon in 2007, I think something that it wasn't just Oregon. I mean, it was most of the American wine scene, I think there wasn't, people had maybe traveled to Burgundy once. They would have never gone to Bordeaux. They certainly wouldn't have come down to California. And that has changed, and that is good, because it's impossible to get better at this wine business, which is an oxymoron, if you don't explore and particularly understand. Find those wines that move you, and then go visit those people and understand what they're doing, because you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to bring that back, and you're not going to maybe apply it exactly, but you're going to apply pieces of it, and it's going to inform your winemaking, your grape growing, and it's going to influence you, and it's going to create conversations with colleagues that also feel the same way, and that is all just like hugely beneficial to the progress of an appellation and to the development of vineyards and wineries and brands and domains. So I think that IP&C always brought people here, but we didn't see a lot of people from here going out. And we see that a lot more now. That's the thing about being a Californian, right? Is like you're never really like from anywhere. Most people in California are transplants. I mean, Raj is from India, and I'm half Japanese. And we really embrace, particularly for me and Raj, we embrace racial diversity, and we embrace traveling, and not really we have homes, but we're always on the road. And here, a lot of people feel there's a strong sense of community, which is wonderful, but there's not the same, not that same kind of embrace of diversity, particularly racial diversity, and also the sense of seeing the adventure of seeing what other people are doing and appreciating what other people are doing, even though it might be very different than what you do.
Leads me nicely to my next question. You talked about you're on the road a lot. You mentioned you own 4 different things spread out geographically. Tell me about that. How do you give everything its due time and due effort and feel like you're on top of things while also sort of maintaining sanity?
The wine quality is the barometer. So as long as the wine quality is continually improving and getting better, even though there's a lot of other things that are slipping through the cracks, I feel I can go to bed at night. If the wine quality is suffering, then that's a real check. It's like, okay, need to check in, need to maybe slow down, need to refocus, recenter. I got into this business as a winemaker, and I think I'll always use that as it's my North Star, it's my barometer, it's my way of making sure that we're doing a good job.
So you talked earlier about something that we've heard people talk about before a little bit, but not quite the same way you talked about the wrong grapes, the wrong places. So I'm curious about, as you've gotten to explore Oregon and the Valley, what do you think about what we've done here so far, and what do you think about the future? What will the future kind of showcase for Oregon, or just what will be discovered here?
Well, it's hard because obviously, when you think about growing grapes and planting a vineyard, Pinot Noir is a natural fit because you know that you can get the price. There are a lot of other grape varieties that would do really well here, but obviously some of them are very obscure, and it's hard to get the price. So I think that it'll largely fall to the people who aren't businessmen and businesswomen, who just want to try and make the best Trousseau or the best Chenin Blanc or the best Gamay or the best Riesling or Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, there's obviously so many varieties that would do so well here. But the spirit there has to just be that you're doing that not because it's what maybe makes the most business sense, but because you're just so passionate about it. And enough people do that, and then the price comes. So that's been the story with basically so many appellations in California too, you know. And I think that that's a tremendous opportunity for the Willamette Valley and just all the appellations to the whole state. You know, there's just that's what's so exciting. There's no limits. You know, it's not like Burgundy. It's not like the Northern Rhone Valley. It's not like a lot of places in Europe where it's pretty much been predetermined. Here, nothing is predetermined, which is amazing. And it's not, I don't think it's our job anymore to do that. But it will be for the next generation. There should be some of that rebellion. Like, why do we only grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay here? Like, why don't we grow all these other cool varieties? And not as just an experiment or a hobby, but actually really lean into it, right? Like, pick an amazing site and plant something like Sauvignon Blanc or Chenin Blanc, you know, on a site where everyone's telling you, I can't believe you're doing that. Why? You should be planting Pinot Noir there, or at least Chardonnay. They're like, no, I'm going to do this. Like that's something that would be thrilling.
Earlier, you brought up some of the weather issues we've had, or climate issues we've had recently. I'm curious about sort of 2020 from your perspective. Obviously, a big year and a big bad year. Oregon suffering its first real wildfire in the valley sort of event during that harvest. Tell me about how you navigated 2020, what the effects were, and sort of the decisions and pivots you had to make because of the pandemic, because of the smoke. How you came out the other side?
Well, we declassified the vintage, basically. We did make some wine and we did bottle some wine, but we sold it all as very inexpensive wine. I think the hardest thing about it was that, it's subjective. So some people think their wines are fine and other people think their wines are bad. It's location. You know, some areas were worse affected than other areas. Some grape varieties were affected worse than other grape varieties. So I don't think we're through it at all. It was traumatic vintage, but I think we're going to be, because people bought a lot of wine, and people will be drinking those wines years from now, and some of them will be great, and some of them will be smoke tainted, and that's really confusing for the consumer. And once you sell that wine, you can't take it back. You know, maybe a rare winery would reach out to all their customers and be like, if you have any bottles of 2020, we'll buy them all back from you. I mean, it's unheard of. But it's really troubling. And I mean, we all know it's not the last wildfire that's going to happen to Oregon. I'd like to see you know, the other huge disadvantage we have is that, like in most European wine regions, the government is hugely supportive of their wine industry through subsidies and promotion, marketing. I mean, our government does nothing for us. And that was a real example of where the state of Oregon and the federal government could have helped wineries make the decisions that maybe they felt were really hard for them to make financially. You know, we had to rely on crop insurance. That just should have been almost like a FEMA type thing. Like, this sector got devastated. You know, here's a bailout. Because in the long run, we don't want to hurt this industry. We don't want to hurt the reputation. of this industry. We don't want wineries to suffer financially because of one event. So, but that's someone else's fight, not mine.
Add to the next generation list there, along with her.
We have a lot of work to do, don't they?
All right, so a couple questions left for you. First one is, we talked about the future for Oregon. Tell me about the future for yourself. What are you looking at on the horizon? What's coming next, and sort of what are you looking forward to?
We have kind of an interesting structure at our wineries. The wineries are all independent entities, but they don't have any staff. The staff is all hired by my company, which is called Provenage. And it's become very clear to me that the wine industry has become so expensive. The barrier of entry is so much higher than when I started my own brand in 2003, that for young people who don't have trust funds, it's getting progressively harder to be an entrepreneur and a business owner in the wine industry. So Provenage is my kind of solution to that. I hope to, in the coming years, to invite my employees who want to participate at an ownership level to come in and participate in the wine business in the way that they can most economically, and use their skills and their talents to help lots of entities, winery owners, vineyard owners, achieve their goals and their aspirations. And by being a bigger team, we will collaborate more, we will learn more, we'll have the opportunity to work with many talented people, and also integrate sales and marketing with production, with operations and farming, so that there's a true kind of cohesiveness of the whole life cycle of wine, not just part of it. So that's the future that I'm focused on for the humans. For the properties, it's just, trying to achieve legacy.
Never heard it put quite that way before. Achieve legacy. I like that. All right. So I said earlier that I was going to ask you, why is your wine different? So tell us, why is your wine different?
I honestly think it's because of the tremendous people that I get to work with. Raj and I know our collaboration has led to so many conversations and discussions and dreams. And there's no way I could have had those dreams on my own. And today we have a lot of new people participating in those conversations, and I think it's invaluable to believing that you can always do better, believing that you can always find even more magic and elegance and beauty and deliciousness in a bottle of wine.
Like it. All right. All the questions that I have for you.
Great.
Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover?
God, I think I talked way too much.
Not even. We could have kept going. Thank you so much for your time, for your hospitality, for sharing your wine with us. It was very, very generous of you. We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.